Hello, I'm Mike McGuire. It is Thursday, July the 24th, 2025, the day that Terry Bollea, also known as Hulk Hogan professionally, passed away. It was reported earlier this morning that Hogan had passed away. A report of a cardiac arrest was called from his home. Ambulances came and took him to hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival. Now, many of the medical details obviously are unknown. Those details are going to roll out. I'm going to go ahead and preface this by saying that there wasn't going to be a regular McGuire on Wrestling show this week. In fact, the plan was to take a holiday, and that holiday started about 12 hours ago. But given the magnitude of what's going on and what we do here, I decided to spend some time talking to people, and I was also requested by some people to offer some thoughts and obviously contribute to news stories. Nothing like the likes of Greg Oliver and John Pollock and people like that who are talking to some major places. But I do want to thank my friend Shane Hewitt down at News Talk Radio for having me on his show, as well as a few other radio stations and pressers that reached out and I talked to today. And it's funny because every conversation I've had has always kind of had the same theme, and it stemmed from a conversation that I had twofold. One with Stephen Bennett from our Legends and Champions panel. You're going to hear some of that later on as we release a proper show later on. But another guy who reached out and we started talking about it. I said, you don't talk about wrestling anymore, but I have a feeling you'd like to talk about this guy. And he said, absolutely. So I'd like to take this time to share this audio uncut with Dan the Mouth Lovranski. Of course, Dan, one of the hosts of Live Audio Wrestling since its infancy, then went on to, I joined him actually on the old Sunday Night's Main Event crew. He went his way, I went mine, and we still stay in touch. We're still good friends, and I knew that Dan would probably have something interesting to say, and sure enough, he did. So you're going to hear a lot of rhetoric, a lot of things about Hulk Hogan. These are just our thoughts, and yours are always welcome. If you want to share them on our Facebook page, look up Celebrate Wrestling, McGuire on Wrestling. Join us there, and it's a complicated conversation, but it's one that a lot of wrestling fans are going to have this week for sure, and probably into the future, talking about the life of the character and the man behind Hulk Hogan. Well, not to make light of anything, but you know it's a big happening in the world of wrestling history when I can drag this guy back to talk about pro wrestling. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan the Mouth Lovranski is here. Mouth, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, Mike. Thanks for having me on. I mean, Hulk Hogan, a pretty monumental character in the history of pro wrestling, and someone for me that's been part of my wrestling experience for so long because, I was the right age when the expansion took place, and it's just so incredible to have watched the whole thing unfold. So that brings me out of the I'll come out of the woodwork for that.
And that's the interesting perspective you have versus me, even because I was just talking to Stephen Bennett about how my wrestling fandom came in around that, 85, 86, 87 maybe sort of run, right? And so Hogan is right there in front of everybody, God and country. He's everywhere. He's showing up in movies. He's making movies. Like, it's crazy. And so as a kid coming into this realm of Hulkamania and the WWF doing what they were doing and just literally taking over the industry and territories and whatnot. I didn't have that perspective, obviously. I didn't grow up watching AWA. I didn't know about that history before and what a force that he and frankly, his crew of people, guys like me and Gene, guys like Andre even, and you go back further, like all these people that came in to the WWF to be around Hogan and elevate this thing even bigger. So take us back to your perception of Hulk Hogan's impact as a wrestler, and then we'll talk about maybe the later years and how maybe that affected your fandom later on. But take us back to what you remember of Hulk Hogan first really dominating the scene.
Well, whatever you think of him as a personality, you have to accept the fact that Hulk Hogan is a wrestling icon. He might have not been the greatest performer in the ring, but he had the great promos. He had the great talk, the gift of the gab. Like, that was it for me, was that he was so great. He had the natural charisma. I went to lots of his matches live, and in the ring, it was not much to sneeze. And in fact, it used to make me so mad the way that certain wrestlers would have to completely change their style to work a match with Hogan. Like, I'd see him work with guys like Butch Reed and that, and they would have to completely change their style of working to accommodate the clothesline and the leg drop and the 1, 2, 3, right? But he was such a big force, and me watching wrestling at the time, it was astounding because it was all just still a small scale thing. You watched it on Saturdays. Then all of a sudden it explodes. It's on music shows. It's on the news. It's like everywhere. And, Hogan, you knew at that time it was all centered around Hogan, right? He was the main guy. He was the guy that held it all together. Yeah, you had a great cast of unique characters that Vince pilfered from everywhere else, but Hogan was the man running the train at that time. And even, like I said, even though I didn't dig him in the ring, I saw he had such an unstoppable personality at that point in his career. It was more than any other time in his career. And as you know, Vince would have never got as far as he did without Hogan. But you could see it from the beginning, especially when he came in and he beat the Iron Sheik, and it just exploded after that. Yeah,
and I think that you probably remember a time in your life as well where, and honestly, the world was a lot bigger back in the day. People didn't travel as much to do things as much as they do now. Like, I grew up mostly in Red Deer, Alberta, which is between Calgary and Edmonton, right in the middle. And Calgary and Edmonton would get the WWF house shows, and Hogan would come through. And I remember seeing pictures of the Hulkster looking just how he looked on TV, in the Edmonton Northlands Coliseum, pointing at the ring, going to take on Earthquake. And I would think, it was really only 2 hours away, but we didn't have money. We didn't go to Edmonton for anything. And so, it might as well have been Disneyland because it was that far away. So even though everything was smaller, there was still this kind of mythological force around a lot of these characters, to those of us, especially in smaller markets, you being in a bigger area where, like you said, you got to see Hogan all the time there. To still have that mystique and to still have that much presence, that speaks really to, we talk about New York and Toronto and Chicago and cities that have seen it all when it comes to wrestling, and they're still getting frenetic and even maybe not doing that much in the ring. The guy was able to work his way to his advantage to rile those crowds and to keep them coming back for more.
Yeah, he was absolutely a master of that. And that was back when the house shows were the bread and butter of the promotion, right? And they would work these 3 or 4 long events in a row. Like, Hogan would come in first, fight with Kamala, ends in the double DQ. Okay, then they come back and have the no holds barred, and something happens to that, somebody interferes. Okay, then it's the cage match after that. Like, they would work these long storylines. So guys like that, they would have the time to they'd come back to these cities over and over in these short periods of time, and the people would just get so wrapped up in the stories. And he was incredibly good at all that kind of stuff. Like, you cannot fault him in any way in terms of being able to attract people. The one other thing, though, you have to remember, though, is he was also in the era of the 3 R's, and that's Reagan, Rambo, and Rocky. And the whole Hogan persona is created at a time when American patriotism is at really quite an all-time high, in that rough, rugged, strong American appearance and look. And he just kind of personified that, as this gigantic cartoon character for all the little kids. And, Hulk Hogan represents America because America is great and America is strong and America is mighty. So, he had all that kind of stuff, I think, in there as well. And then, of course, the music side, the rock and wrestling, and getting into MTV and all that, you just created so much more opportunities for him and more chances for people to see him.
And that's just it. It became so mainstream. There's already discussion of who was bigger, Vince or Hulk, and who made it bigger. I heard some interesting conversations today. We're recording this conversation with Dan the day that it happened on July 24th. So, stuff is just starting to trickle out now. And obviously everybody has their gut reactions to Hulk Hogan and what he meant. But when it comes down to the popularization of the WWF, of Hulk Hogan, the one thing I'm hearing from a lot of people who were older in the scene, I'm not saying that to be funny, but of an age where you had seen what else was around at the time, the common consensus I'm hearing is that there probably wasn't anybody else that could do this the way Hogan did it. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't think anyone would have. I know he had the Vince McMahon machine behind him,
right?
But Hogan had the unique personality and charisma that was just in sync with the times. I can't think of anyone at that time period that would have been able to get what Vince got out of Hulk Hogan. I just think it was one of those stellar moments when everything just kind of all came together. The culture was in the right mindset. He was in the right place at the right time. A couple good connections with big time media. All of a sudden, he's on every talk show in the world. I don't think there could have been anyone else outside of Hogan. I really don't. I don't even think if you'd put it behind Flair, because you'd have to be the good guy. Flair was not. He admits it himself. He liked playing the heel role better. I can't think of anyone that you would put in that role outside of Hulk Hogan. It's not going to be Bob Backlund, or it's not going to be, honestly, there would have been no one at that time that you could put in that spot.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't come without its own struggles as well for Hogan in that era. I mean, the one thing I think of off the hop immediately is the Richard Belzer interview situation, right? Where if you're not familiar with the story, basically Hogan was on this talk show and Richard Belzer, the host, comedian, TV personality, has him on and wants Hulk to demonstrate a move and I don't remember what kind of sleeper or what kind of hold it was called, but it was basically a chokehold that knocked the guy out and dropped him on his head and split his head open. There was a lawsuit and everything else that happened from that. And I mean, that was at a time where that could have really caused a lot of damage to the Hulk Hogan and WWF machine at the time. But it was something where it just kind of managed to skate by, really.
It did. It really did nothing. That event really. You know what? It's interesting. Again, I think time period, Mike. I really think that time and era, most of the fans would have thought, Richard Belzer, what a wimp that guy is. You know what I mean? That's good. I like the way Hogan put him on his face like that. Like I think in this day and age, if someone of that they're trying to market as a hero or someone like that went on a show and did that, yeah, absolutely, there would be issues. But I think, honestly, back then, plus wasn't Richard Belzer on cable? No one really saw his show that much.
Well, and that's a fair argument, and again, not to be funny either. I mean, we in Canada, I think, take cable numbers for granted. I don't know about you, but I've always noticed that a lot of households in Canada always had cable because we just didn't have the network reach, and maybe it was more affordable. But I remember cable being like a luxury item to a lot of Americans. So yeah, the audience was probably a lot smaller, but it was still one of those things where, I mean, the WWF was doing well, but had this guy managed to cash in huge, I mean, that could have shut everything down, really.
It could have. But again, I'm not saying what happened was obviously the right thing or anything like that. No. Just feel at that time, and with the momentum behind it, I just felt that it's not going to be an issue at that point.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's it. You've got Hulk Hogan, you got Mr. T, who was one of the biggest stars on television at the time.
Exactly.
The whole Rocky thing with Stallone, who has released his own comments about Hogan, obviously. I mean, the guy had such a cultural impact and such a far spread that transcended a lot of pro wrestling and brought eyes to where he was because he was this larger-than-life character.
Yes.
If you're just tuning in, this is McGuire on Wrestling, talking to Dan the Mouth Lovranski about Hulk Hogan and, of course, the legacy and everything behind him. Now, we've obviously talked about that. There's a time where he leaves the business for a short while, goes to WCW, runs against competition. In between that, there's a steroid trial where he basically was supposed to be the prosecution's golden boy against Vince McMahon, and that ends up reversing. Still, Hogan manages to, again, kind of skate away from any controversy, no matter what. I mean, he's on Arsenio talking about steroids and denying and saying, if I did, and all these things, and the guy really seemed Teflon for a long time. fast forward to the early 2000s after WCW closed his shop and all the business that they did there. And don't get me wrong, he did a lot of business for WCW.
Absolutely. When he first came in there in that mid-90s period, those pay-per-views were doing like pretty good numbers, better than WCW had been doing in years.
And that was it. This guy still had box office. The guy still had value, and it became a talking point to the point when WCW did close down that they brought Hogan back. And there was this renaissance. I don't know if you were there, but I was there. It was my first WrestleMania. It was the only time I ever got to see Hogan wrestle live, but I was there for what many people still call one of the greatest matches in wrestling history, not because of its wrestling, but because of its cultural significance of Hogan and The Rock. And I remember being there for that moment. I was there. Yeah. And so you know exactly what it was like. Yeah. It was talking about with Stefan earlier. It was insane. People, grown people jumping up and down out of their seats in 2002 because they're getting shades of the old Hulkster after this big heel run. This is at a time where Hogan's credibility was still at a point where some fans had questioned, some fans were tired of it, but the big love fest of him coming back to the WWF seemed to forgive a lot of that and fed this momentum to have another run with him as champion, another run with him as the main guy on a lot of shows for a while, and in major programs again. So again, Hogan kind of skates by.
And again, and that's a testimony to how people felt. That the reason that stuff happened at that WrestleMania is because you had the clash of all the newer fans, but they weren't that old enough to not remember like that. Or I think more likely what it was like at that time is that you almost have the father-son dynamic then, where the fathers watched a lot of the early stuff and grew up with Hogan, and now he's taking his son, and gets to see Hogan's big comeback. It's a testimonial to the success he had, that people like me, believe me, for years on the Law, I was the guy going, he's done, put it to bed, don't sign him. Yeah. But he would come back every time and he would pull something off, and they would get more and more mileage out of him. The trouble is that he didn't know when to stop driving the car, and they rode the mileage out of it, unfortunately.
Well, and this is kind of the thread I want to follow here, because I talked about this earlier, and it's funny. I don't mean to correlate the two in any other way other than kind of a similar mindset around their star level and their celebrity. And I'm not saying that the guy was anywhere like the level of Hogan was, but I talked last week about how Goldberg and how he's feeling about how his retirement went and everything. And when you're that guy, I mean, I see it with wrestlers today. I could say I see it with Brett. I see it with a lot of people where, if you're of a certain caliber of famous, you just get those yes people that think everything you've done is great. You can do no wrong, because they know that's what you want to hear, is that you've done no wrong. We go through all these decades of Hogan going through controversy after controversy after controversy where nothing happens at all. And then the tape comes out, and it was 2015. And it's funny because I remember I got my grip and grin photo that I've posted on our Facebook page with him in 2013, and 2015, 2 years later, there's this tape, there's this awful racism, there's all this stuff going on. Then the car crash with his son happens, the prison phone calls come out, there's more racism, there's more hate coming out, and just all this stuff is coming around him. And this time, for the first time in the public eye, because it's so grandiose, and because a multi-million-dollar lawsuit comes out of it against Gawker, the stuff is starting to stick to Hogan.
Oh, yeah. After a certain period... sorry, are you going to finish? Or?
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, after a certain period... again, I hate to keep saying this, but it really is part of the times that we live in now. By 2015, everybody is being watched insanely by everyone. TMZ is like the hottest thing in the land, going after stuff like this, trying to get these bits. And when you get to, with the chance that more stuff can get captured and you start to see more of what the guy is like or what he appears to be like, then nothing is going to save you. By, exactly once the love tape came out and all all that, and it was too much. No one's image. And again, at this later stage of his career, by this point, a lot of people really are okay. Like Hulk, really now you really just need to fade off, go into the sunset. You're milking it for way too long, and these sort of incidents start to become more and more and more, and it's just it. Such a strange combination of his own personal life kind of going into this crazy spiral that you can't blame anyone but him. But at the same time, again, times changing and going from the patriotism of the 80s to the more times now where we have with someone like Hulk Hogan, and where every eye is on him and everybody's watching what he does. And it got to, I mean, I'm again not justifying anything that he did, right? Anything like that. He made a hell of a lot of mistakes. There's no doubt about it. But again, it's because of the era. You talk about the Richard Belzer stuff. It didn't make much noise because there was nowhere to make any noise.
Yeah.
Now we have everything under the sun to make noise on, right? In terms of social media. So everything can be out there. And, the godliest saint is going to end up getting tarnished in some way or fashion. The thing with Hogan, though, is he didn't seem to know when to pull back, though, right? Like,
well, and this is the point I want to get to here. One of our listeners wrote on our Facebook page, and this is kind of the point I was trying to make, and I think you're going here as well. Bob Hunt, who is a great listener and offers a ton of feedback on all of our content here. He says, the man lived such a uniquely insular life, surrounded by people who formed a fabricated reality that none of us would recognize that world as any sense of normalcy. Can you keep a moral compass when the world falls at your feet to that degree and nobody is there to keep you grounded?
Well, absolutely. That's a very good, strong point. It's so much at once. Everything is thrown at you at once. It's very hard to make the decisions. And again, I just feel he should have known when to pull back. He should have just known to go, okay, I've had a good run. I've had my say. Things are getting dicey. I just need to ride off into the sunset. The fact that he was constantly coming back, the real American beer and showing up at the Republican convention and all that ridiculous stuff, it got to the point, Mike, by the time that he died, that it was like over the top. Like, he had tarnished the legacy so much, that no one was taking him seriously. And, when I went through my Facebook today, which has been very active, A, because of Hulk, and B, Ozzy Osbourne, but so much of the feedback in my Facebook was dealing with that. I'd have maybe one or two that were praising him, and then I'd have like a whole fist load of ones where they were, it's like, they just go, he's a douchebag, he's a whore, he's this and that, and it's really amazing the way the attitudes change and things like that. And Hogan, Hogan just this. I hate to say this, but it was almost the right time for him to finally get out of the picture. And hopefully,
Yeah, I mean, it's a fine line, too, I feel, of, obviously having dislike for someone and then wishing ill on the dead. It's a weird... It's a weird line to cross. Exactly. So we're not going to do that today either here. And I'm not saying that's what you're doing either. But I get what you're saying. It was kind of an enough is enough sort of point. And sadly, there wasn't a chance to have that graceful exit. There wasn't a chance to really bow out and say, hey, thanks for everything. Peace out,
But we are talking about wrestling, right, Mike?
Well, and that's the other thing, too. Everything you described with the RNC, with the beer, with everything else, it's two things, right? It's crowds and cash. And that's what wrestlers live to perform for.
Yeah, that's it. He wants those pops, right? He still wants to get that pop, even if he has to deal with Donald Trump to do it.
And people will still give it. That's the other thing, too. There's kids today, like young kids who know who Hulk Hogan is, either because they saw it through their family or, again, because the accessibility of everything online these days.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still such a tantalizing image to see this superhero of a Hulk Hogan, and not have any perception of time or age or anything like that. And so you just see this character and be like, that's amazing. So
Well, it was always, it's like superheroes personified. And if that's ever been an example, Hulk was it, right? Like Hulk had everything, he had like the physique of the Incredible Hulk, and he had the values of Superman. And it was all that, like, he even remember in there. Well, I guess, no, that was more when he was a heel, but when he was with Fred Blassie, he used to wear a cape when he came to the ring.
And the whole Thunderlips thing too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So to close this off, Mouth, and thank you again for taking the time to talk about this today. It's one of those subjects where I mentioned earlier, it's a complicated story of a character versus the person behind it. And sadly, I think that a lot of us in our age group and people that grew up with Hulk Hogan and then witnessed what Terry Bollea became out of Hulk Hogan, we're always going to have to differentiate between the two. And for me, again, I look at Hulk Hogan as that guy that brought me into wrestling, watching wrestling, getting into it, this larger-than-life character, just like all these kids were talking about today. But I can't dismiss or forget all the terrible things that I've seen. And maybe that, again, is partly our fault as fans for going beyond the curtain, so to speak. But you can't not these days. That's what shows like this are based on, is talking about the greater... the greater aspect of it all. So, Mouth, I have to ask you this because we do try and skew on the positive when it comes to wrestling. I mean, not forgiving or forgetting, obviously, the terrible things that have happened here. I mean, is it okay for fans to miss Hulk Hogan and still recognize Terry Bollea and stay in that middle ground?
I think so. I think that's what you have to do ultimately with all your so-called idols or people that you respect. You have to, because no one's clean. No one doesn't have skeletons in the closet. And, there are tons of people in all different areas of art and culture that are looked upon as huge individuals that all have sullen moments in their past, right? It's just how much you have to kind of differentiate between the two and how much you're willing to give or take when you respect or you think about someone or you're influenced by someone. You have to figure out, is the ratio right? A lot of people, I'll use a music example with Ted Nugent. A lot of people hate Ted Nugent because of his political views and the way he carries himself, but I love Ted Nugent as a guitar player. As a guitar player, Ted Nugent is fantastic, and I can sit down and listen to his records and I can just forget about Ted the blabbermouth and just listen to Ted the guitar player. So it really depends on how much give and take you want to give with someone like this. I think for me with Hogan, I was never his biggest fan. Like I was old enough by the time that's going on that I was much more into the unique characters like the Savages and guys like that and the Flairs and that. But I always understood what he did for pro wrestling and that it would never have got even to the level it is at today without what happened with him in the 80s. So yeah, you can't ignore that. The other parts of his life, obviously, there were things he didn't do properly, and that's up to the individual to decide whether that's enough or I just go, no, he was a jerk, forget him.
There you go, Dan the Mouth Lovranski. Thank you for making the time again, buddy. I have a couple interview requests I have to jump to. I was actually supposed to start a vacation today, so it's been
it's been a bit
of an interesting day here today. So I'm going to thank everybody for listening to this. There will be some form of a proper McGuire on Wrestling show, and we're going to delve more into this. This segment probably has been a part of one of those as well, but I thought nobody better in our circle to talk to about the recent passing of Terry Bollea, Hulk Hogan, than Dan Lovranski. So thank you very much, sir. We'll talk again soon, okay?
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mike.